Welcome to Gospel Perspectives on World History, and I'm your host, Michael Stone. Thank you for joining us as we begin looking at the secular history of the world through the lens of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So again, important reminder here, while this podcast is primarily geared towards members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, anyone who has an interest in topics of faith and history are welcome to join us. And another very important reminder, while I do intend to center what I share as much as possible on the verified details of the historical record and on ancient and modern scripture approved by the church, I do want to stress that the views I share here do not necessarily represent official doctrine, policy, or the views of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that I take full responsibility for the content and programming of this podcast. So, last time, we discussed the Old Stone Age, or the Paleolithic era, and how while there were definite disadvantages to being a hunter-gatherer, there were several powerful benefits we enjoyed during that time. Now, we are going to take a look at the event that got rid of most of those benefits, like the leisure time we used to have, the relative gender equality, and the better diet and exercise lifestyle, and traded those benefits for the onset of the threat of epidemics, large-scale wars, gender inequality, government, money, politics, and all the other messy trappings of civilization. The thing that brought on all those changes? The Neolithic Revolution. So, as I was writing the material for this episode, I had to stop and take a break because I remembered I needed to feed the chickens. My family has 16 of them, and to tell you the truth, I grew up never fancying myself one of those weird chicken people. But I never planned on marrying as high up as I did. And with all of the advantages of being married to Becca, there is one little cost, and it's her thing with animals. This is the first year in a very long time that we have not bought a new pet or some other creature. It's actually gotten so bad that I literally have nightmares about my wife wanting to get new animals. After all the cycling through of animals with the move from Utah to Wyoming and some of the animals getting caught by raccoons and everything, we have finally narrowed down our non-human occupants on my property to 2 cats and 16 chickens. I do love the cats. They are the best. And the 15 hens we have are good layers. They're pretty good. Our rooster, though, is a straight-up jerk. I won't miss him. Especially if on his way out he gets fried and battered and served up with some good barbecue sauce. Hashtag in search of a recipe. But, besides the rooster, I have actually come to really enjoy having all the animals around. It's just the strangest thing to see these modern dinosaurs strolling around my backyard, especially as I sit munching on my tortilla chips served with garden salsa that my wife so professionally grew and then prepared on her own. And yet, the innovation that made all this possible, the advent of systematic planned agriculture, is argued by some to be the worst mistake in all of human history. And mind you, that includes the invention of bathroom scales. Now, principally, the historian whose name is most associated with this newer way of looking at the innovation of agriculture goes by the name of Jared Diamond. This is the same guy who wrote a very influential book that also got adapted into a best-selling documentary called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Now, more recently, there's been some new skepticism raised about this claim, and I'll share some of the counter-arguments to Diamond's thesis here in this podcast, but we can take a look at some of the basics of his views on agriculture for the sake of analysis. At its core, the agricultural revolution, or the Neolithic Revolution that is sometimes called, referring to this time period as the New Stone Age as opposed to the Old Stone Age. This is where most historians agree that this thing we call civilization arises. Now, I really want to be careful about using that word because it comes along with a pretty charged and loaded set of baggage. When we eventually talk about colonialism, yeah, you'll get what I mean there. But in this context, I'm going to refer to civilized peoples as those who have at least a number of the following traits. And these are the traits that I didn't just pick and choose. This following list contains most, if not all, of the key characteristics most historians agree a civilization should have. And I'm doing air quotes there. So here's those attributes. First, permanent settlements. Second, structures. Third, a writing system. Fourth, some form of art. Fifth, a government. And sixth, a formalized belief system or religion. So hopefully it isn't too hard to see how farming would lend itself to the establishment of each of these elements. You see, the key advantage that farmers have as opposed to hunter-gatherers is caloric surplus. Farmers simply are able to provide a great deal more food than hunters and gatherers can. This is because somewhere along the way, perhaps in several different times and places around the world, some of the hunter-gatherers figured out that they wouldn't have to go out every day to find food if they simply nourished and cultivated it right where they were. And if there is one constant to human history, it's this: people hate exercise. I'm serious about this. People hate exercise. This is going to be a driving force for some of the greatest, biggest changes that we experience as a race. It's people trying to get out of work, trying to get out of exercise. So anyway, as soon as some of them had figured out how planting works and how they could domesticate animals, their clans stopped moving around. They could stay in one place. The trick is, farmers are almost too good at providing food. One farm can grow enough to feed itself and several other individuals in the community several times over. So, all of a sudden, not everyone has to be employed in the food industry. The only and first industry there was for as long as anyone could remember. Several people who maybe can't grow food as well as the more talented farmers, but have talents in other areas, are now free to explore those skills and to develop them. People who are good with their hands and would like to build things could. Farmers needed a way to protect their fields and flocks while they are at work, after all. Where would the animals be sheltered? What is going to stop thieves or raiders from running in and simply taking this easy-to-grab food? Structures. Walls, stables, farmhouses. And as many other people began establishing themselves in these other lines of work, they're going to need places to live and work in as well. Thanks to these structures, people begin living in much more tightly packed, much more densely packed pockets of civilization all across the world. Now, what is the problem that someone like Jared Diamond would see with this? Well, again, it's much easier now for disease to spread, since people are so densely packed together in these cities. The threat of epidemics has been with us ever since the first cities were founded, with those same diseases being communicated via the emerging trade routes that came to being. Before 2020, I had to work a little bit with students to convince them that pandemics were a major source of concern, but now, for some reason, it goes without saying that epidemics generally aren't just a minor inconvenience we can afford to ignore. Funny how that works. Now, not everyone is good at farming or at building things. Some people in a society instead are good with keeping track of all the new stuff that is happening. After all, we have emerging trade networks, and with trade comes prices, inventories, haggling, shipments, etc., all of which are much easier to manage if you don't have to memorize all of that information for your growing business. Hence the advent of writing and literacy. Now, here, Jared Diamond generally doesn't have much to say with criticizing this particular development of civilization, though there are some drawbacks, which we'll get to in a minute. There's probably not as much criticism here for good reason, because not only does writing provide a clear, consistent way to standardize trade and cut costs, it allows for one of the single greatest, most taken for granted miracles in all of human history. It allows the dead to speak. King Benjamin pointed out this advantage to his sons in the first chapter of Mosiah in the Book of Mormon, after all, when he explained, "Were it not for these plates, which contain these records and these commandments, we must have suffered in ignorance, even at this present time, not knowing the mysteries of God." And that's Mosiah chapter 1, verse 3. So that's an important little insight. Writing is something that allows civilization to exist. Do we undervalue reading and writing in the world today? When we have the collective wisdom and shared experiences of so many who have gone before us, especially that wisdom we have in the scriptures, do we take the time to read those words? Or are we arrogant enough to think, nah, I can go it alone. Thousands of years of human experiences, mistakes made, lessons learned, truths told, I don't need it. My invitation to you is, if you don't already have a habit of reading the scriptures daily, make it happen. This is how we can ensure that we ourselves and our families don't suffer in ignorance. And we are encouraged in the Doctrine and Covenants to seek out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning. And I don't think that injunction is limited to scripture only. Ray Bradbury had it right when he said that you don't have to burn books to destroy a culture. Just get people to stop reading them. Read good books. Now, there are some drawbacks with the advent of writing, and they're very much similar to those we find with art. But before anyone out there starts accusing me of being an iconoclast or something crazy, art is an indispensable part of the human experience we simply can't get rid of, even if we wanted to. The act of creating art is one of those most sacred experiences in life where we can draw close to the ultimate creator and artist. And as his children, creation is our inherited legacy and our divine destiny. As then President Uchtdorf mentioned in his fall 2008 conference address, after all, and I quote, "The desire to create is one of the deepest yearnings of the human soul. No matter our talents, education, backgrounds, or abilities, we each have an inherent wish to create something that did not exist before. As you take the normal opportunities of your daily life and create something of beauty and helpfulness, you improve not only the world around you, but also the world within you." A close quote. And yet, especially during this early age of human history, as is still very much the case today, unfortunately, art has a dark potential to it as well. In the Neolithic Revolution, much of the art then was used primarily as state propaganda. Take, for example, the Victory Stela of Naram Sin. While it is today a priceless historical artifact that has taught us much about the Akkadian Empire, at the time of its creation, it was used to celebrate the bloody conquest of yet another king who wanted his people to worship him as a god. Hence his relative prominence in the relief as he crushes his victims underfoot, thrusting a spear into the throat of one of the few survivors of the battle. For much of the population who can't read, these pieces of art were a warning and a reminder to watch out and make sure that they toe the line with what the king tells them to do. Art was a means to an end. It was a form of control very often. And unfortunately, we can see very much the same thing happening today with many of the commercials and advertising and media we consume on a daily basis. I do believe my business management professor from BYU had it right when he said that while there is good that can be accomplished with marketing, there is also a great potential for evil. Much of the world's destructive cultural norms are transmitted through the ads that pop up in what we see, hear, and even read. Though I certainly hope when you are reading advertisements that you are looking at a web page or a magazine, because if you're looking at a book when ads pop up, either you are not well or you may need to consider buying a different book. Speaking of state propaganda, that brings us to the next aspect of civilization, the government. Here I'll just put a little plug in for a good scripture read. Doctrine and Covenants, section 134. If you want a clear, concise statement on our church's stance on government in general, that's the first place I'd point you to. And it is because of those ideas in that section and elsewhere in the revealed word given to us that I personally believe something that some people will find very controversial. Government is necessary. Governments were instituted by God for our benefit and are necessary for protecting the natural rights for its citizens, the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. And for Neolithic humans, governments were also crucial for those same reasons. When you have a bunch of people living near each other, there needs to be a common set of expectations and rules to protect each individual's natural rights. And I am going to invoke a little bit of Thomas Hobbes here and state that if governments were not given some power to enforce these rules and expectations, life would indeed be nasty, short, and brutish, to say the least. That being said, I hope I'm not the first person to have ever told you that there are some definite downsides to government. When government offices are held by the corrupt, that's when we see much of the worst that humanity is capable of. And for the Neolithic age, while there were a number of leaders all across the spectrum of decent, all the way over to monster, this time period, like several others, does a pretty good job showing many of the limitations of monarchies. In fact, King Benjamin gave a pretty good mini lecture on this topic in Mosiah chapter 29. And I'll go ahead and read here. Now I say unto you that because all men are not just, it is not expedient that you should have a king or kings to rule over you. For behold, how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed, yea, and what great destruction. And behold, now I say unto you, ye cannot dethrone an iniquitous king, save it be through much contention and the shedding of much blood. For behold, he has his friends in iniquity, and he keepeth his guards about him, and he teareth up the laws of those who have reigned in righteousness before him, and he trampleth under his feet the commandments of God. And he enacteth laws, and sendeth them forth among his people, yea, laws after the manner of his own wickedness. And whosoever doth not obey his laws, he causeth to be destroyed. And whosoever doth rebel against him, he will send his armies against them to war. And, if he can, he will destroy them. And thus an unrighteous king doth pervert the ways of all righteousness. Close quote. And unfortunately, all across world history, we see this very pattern repeated again and again and again. And mind you, these iniquitous kings King Benjamin talks about don't always have the title of king. I'd invite you to consider the possibility that much of what King Benjamin was saying there can also apply to any government officer who seeks to use his authority to support and buttress whichever brand of iniquity is the flavor of the day. In all such cases, however, we see a trend that has been with us ever since the Neolithic Revolution. Many of these laws created by these kings are used primarily to benefit people like themselves, the elites of society. Where during the Paleolithic age, the resources of the world were about as equally shared between individuals as you could get, wealth and power become hyper-concentrated very quickly as those individuals, short on work ethic but gifted with enough luck and charisma, begin setting up governments, primarily to benefit themselves instead of their people. So, even many of the religions at this time were ultimately, unfortunately, perverted to support these kings. In many cases, early religions, and I think particularly Zoroastrianism, did a miraculous job in helping everyone in their society to live better, more decent, more moral lives. And that's because Zoroastrianism, like many other faiths, are based on a number of wholesome eternal truths that transcend our little existence here on this earth, not only giving meaning to each life of each person in a civilization, but also helping promote the overall spiritual, physical, and emotional welfare of the entire community. And yet, one of the most understated things I could say about religion in history is that it can cause a number of dysfunctions for society. When religion is used, for example, to compel its followers to advance an unjust war, or to inflict violence on others, That's where we unfortunately get much of the catalog of man's cruelty to man in world history. Case in point, listen to the story and see if it sounds familiar. A son is born in one of these early civilizations, right in Mesopotamia, in fact. He is actually taught the gospel during this time, and even receives the priesthood. But his father and much of the rest of his family abandoned those gospel truths, instead turning to these same idols of the time. Not much is said in the records we have as to why, but perhaps it may be that these other worldviews, these other gods were offering, were more popular, more socially acceptable, more sensational than the humdrum simple faith that they had started with. Now, ultimately, everyone has their own freedom of choice for what they'll believe, and perhaps had the story ended there, we could maybe sympathize a little bit more with the rest of the son's family. Except that core to the practice of worshiping these other idols that they had turned to is the problematic practice of human sacrifice. And it is the same family that turns on this son, and he's the one that is offered up as a sacrifice to the idolatrous god Elkanah. Fortunately, he escapes, which I suppose is a good thing, because apparently he goes on to accomplish a few significant things in history. I think he went by the name of Abraham, apparently. Yeah, anyway, much of that experience you can read about in Abraham chapter 1 and the Pearl of Great Price. And spoiler alert, actually, yeah, he's kind of a big deal. So, anyway, moving on. When religion is founded on eternal truths and eternal priorities, its value to society quickly becomes incalculable. The damage it can do to society, however, when it is used as a tool of oppression, is likewise incalculable. And for me personally, it's good to remember that even my own deeply held beliefs of the gospel, if twisted to support my own pride or to harm others, can fall into that very same category of oppression, though I can perhaps take comfort in the fact that I haven't messed up enough to have wanted to sacrifice anyone as of yet. Now, perhaps you can see how Jared Diamond did get some traction with his argument that the Neolithic Revolution was the biggest mistake in human history, because without it, the idea of owning land and needing to secure more land would never have been important, because, well, no farms. Without that, we wouldn't have large-scale wars. But here we are. So many of the darkest chapters in human history would not have been possible if it were not for the Neolithic Revolution. And yet, life expectancy did rise as food became more and more plentiful and easier to acquire. Some of the world's great religions like Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and Judaism were founded during this time period, forever blessing the lives of people all around the world. And for the first time, when someone told a story, it could be recorded and remembered for the rest of time. So what might be the takeaway in all of this? There's several, not all of which I could possibly share here or really even think of. But first, I think the Neolithic Revolution shows how there must be opposition in all things, as we are taught in the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi chapter 2. Just as is the case with the internet, AI, or any of the other myriad of new technological revolutions we are witnessing in our world today, people are free to choose how they will use or abuse these new opportunities. I only pray that we can have the integrity to resist the temptation to abuse the opportunities the revolutions of today, and even still, the old opportunities that the Neolithic Revolution brings to us on a daily basis. These changes, for good or ill, are here to stay. Whether they'll be for good or for ill, however, I think is up to us. And that concludes today's episode. Join us next time as we back away from this more generalized survey of the history of the time and instead begin zooming in on some of these specific civilizations in particular, beginning with the earliest one for which we have records, the birthplace of Abraham, Mesopotamia. Do you have a comment or a question about something I shared in this episode today? Go ahead and leave us a voice message if you're using the Spotify platform, and if not, feel free to leave a review or a comment on your selected podcast listening platform. I would like to thank everyone who supported the launch of this podcast, including my lovely wife, my kids, and my loving brother-in-law Spencer, for suggesting I go through with this idea. And again, thank you for listening, and stay safe out there.